Hello, my name is Dr. Susan Robbins, and the class is Drugs and Society. Say hello to future home viewing audiences, class, and use the microphones. Ah, that's right. Smile pretty and wave. Okay. We're going to have a two-part lecture today. We're waiting for Professor Terrell to get here because he's been stuck in traffic. And I'm going to go over some things that I didn't get a chance to finish last week. But we had a question left over from last week, Ashley, that I would like you to ask so that I can answer on camera.
The question was about methadone and how it's treated in clinics, and is it treated with personal physicians, and the recovery concept.
Okay, and you had a second part to that about why do we use it, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Methadone to date is the most effective treatment to get people off of heroin. And you're asking, is it used in doctor's offices or clinics? It's typically dispensed in clinics rather than in doctor's offices. And you had asked about why don't we titrate people down? Why don't doctors prescribe methadone and then titrate people down? Methadone, and what I told you earlier is that I'd like you to ask that of Dr. Hill as well when he gets here, because he is the specialist with the opiates. Methadone is a tricky drug to get somebody to titrate down. I think one of the problems with methadone treatment is that it is much harder to withdraw from methadone than it is from heroin. One of the patterns that you see very commonly, remember we talked last week about the fact that heroin particularly is very, very addictive. All of the opiates are. I think that I mentioned last week that they invented heroin as a cure for morphine addiction. Did I say that last week? It was invented, it was synthesized in 1898, and it was meant as a cure for morphine addiction. And it cures morphine addiction beautifully. However, it is 3 times as strong as morphine, and therefore it in itself is very addictive. And we also talked last week about the fact that tolerance on heroin, tolerance on opiates, occurs rather quickly compared to other drugs. And therefore dependence, serious physical dependence, also occurs more quickly than most other drugs. So you're left with a real dilemma. When somebody wants to get off those drugs and they withdraw, just stop using it, they go into a horrible withdrawal. Now, part of the problem with tolerance with illegal drugs is that illegal drugs are relatively expensive compared to drugs that you buy in pharmacy. Well, I take that back now. Some pharmaceutical drugs are extremely expensive too. But illegal drugs in general, when people keep getting higher and higher and higher tolerance, they need higher and higher and higher doses. And what happens with your typical long-term heroin user is that their tolerance becomes so profound that they run out of money trying to feed their habit. And these are the folks that are out there selling heroin, not necessarily because they're trying to make money on the heroin, but they're trying to feed their habit by becoming that middleman salesperson or middlewoman salesperson. And therefore, as the tolerance gets to be more and more, it comes to a point that they can no longer afford the heroin. Those are the folks that some of them are actually breaking into our houses, committing petty burglaries, robberies, in order to feed their habit because they cannot get the drug legally. That makes sense so far? What you see with long-time heroin users is that most of them, at some point, their habit gets to be so expensive that in order for them to stay on heroin, they have to get off heroin. Now, that doesn't make sense, does it, on the one hand? In other words, they've got to get their tolerance down. These are people who really like this drug and like it enough so that it is not an atypical pattern with heroin users to routinely go cold turkey. I've worked with lots of heroin users, and when their habit gets to be too expensive, they will squirrel themselves away where they cannot get the heroin for a week or two until all the heroin is out of their system, and they go through this horrible, horrible withdrawal. So they become essentially heroin-free. But the purpose that they're doing that for is not to quit heroin, it's to what? Anybody?
Lower their tolerance so that they can get high cheaper after they have it out of their system?
Yeah, they're lowering their tolerance. They're getting their tolerance back down so that they can achieve that high that they're looking for again. And this is not an uncommon pattern. And this is a very important lesson, by the way, because what this teaches us, among other things, is that anybody can quit drugs. Anybody can quit drugs. Quitting is not the problem. You're going to hear me say this over and over. If a heroin addict can tolerate this horrible, horrible, gut-wrenching, literally, withdrawal, and if you remember of the drugs we talked about last week, You can't tell people to simply cold turkey on alcohol if they're dependent, because they might die. You can't tell people to cold turkey on barbiturates when they're dependent, because they might die. Heroin, they have all of the same symptoms, but they don't go into convulsions and they don't die. So what this teaches us, first of all, is that heroin and heroin addicts can quit on their own, and the quitting is not the problem. The problem with all drug addicts is staying quit. Does that make sense, Joe? We can get anybody to quit. Is there anybody in here who's a former smoker? Raise your hand. I'm the only one? 1, 2, 3. Any current smokers? One brave soul admits to it. Okay. Those of you who tried to quit smoking, how many times did it take you to quit? Amy? Borrow that and use the microphone.
I apologize. About 2 times. I got pregnant and I had to quit. I was forced that way.
And was that the last time you quit? Or you went back?
I went back.
Okay, Dr. Skolnick is going to be talking about nicotine. Nicotine is a very, very addictive drug. Very, very hard to quit. And what you see, how about you? How many times did you quit? Use the mic.
It took me about 3 times. 3 times.
3 times. It took me 3 times to quit. So what that tells us is people can quit drugs. Does that make sense? Asking people to quit and getting them to quit is not the problem. The problem is staying quit. And that's why we have so much relapse, because people quit and they go back. They quit and they go back. Now, methadone, let's go back to your question, Ashley. Methadone raises a very interesting moral question, essentially. In answer to your question, methadone is typically prescribed in clinics where people who are former heroin users, if they are using the methadone properly, are not using heroin, and instead they come to the clinic, and instead of putting a needle in their arm, they are given a liquid form of methadone to drink. So therefore, we are bypassing the real dangers of needles that we talked about last time. We're bypassing the illegal drug trade, and we're giving them a legal medication. Do you hear the difference between drug and medication? And what are the reasons? Now, can it be prescribed by a doctor? Very possibly. I think you could ask Professor Terrell about laws about that. But because it's a legal drug that can be prescribed medically, typically the way it's prescribed is in clinics. But it would be very hard, except for the best pain management people who really understood methadone, to have doctors to have the knowledge to tell people how to titrate down. It's a very hard drug to get off of. Yeah, Matt.
Going on the methadone question, is there like a street value or something to methadone? Because I know I knew someone who would go to the methadone clinic, but they would only be able to. Seems like maybe sometimes they would be able to get like a weekend dose or something like that, but
yeah,
they could only get a certain
yeah, they only give out
amount.
certain amounts.
But if you can't get high on it, I'm just wondering. But some people, like, because he would have to do like a blood test, and if they found that he was like smoking marijuana or something like that, then they would be like, no, you can only get it on a daily basis. Whereas people who would test clean, they could get it for longer periods. But why is that?
Different clinics have different policies, and I don't know enough about their policies to talk about for each different clinic as to what they're looking at. But what you don't want, and unfortunately this happens, is that sometimes people who are on methadone stop using the methadone just long enough to get high on the heroin, and then they go back to the methadone. Or they will try selling their methadone if they're given several doses to take home with them. So is there a street value? The answer is yes, to some extent. When methadone is used for pain relief, it's a very dangerous drug in terms of dose. It's much more difficult to administer dose, at least that is my understanding. That it's much easier to use the narcotic drugs that we already have. And what we've got to recognize, and this brings up the moral issue about why would we treat drug abuse with drugs, right? How many of you have a problem with that? Let's be honest. Only one? Nobody else has a problem? What is the objection then, Ashley?
I guess that way I don't understand recovery. To me, recovery is eventually getting off to a safe plateau where you're functioning and not depending on anything to live.
Let me ask you a question. If we have somebody who is schizophrenic, would we deny giving them antipsychotic medications? If we have somebody who's truly depressed, would we deny giving them antidepressants?
No, but eventually they'll sustain themselves into a level of recovery where they can function. Many eventually get lower doses at some point in their lives. It could be maybe years after recovery, but at some point many want to, and many don't.
Okay, women who want to put off the onset of the change of life, are we going to deny them estrogen?
No, I wouldn't deny anybody anything.
Well,
Do whatever
what I'm
it is
trying
that
to
you
get
need.
at is that what we're looking at is a moral issue, not a scientific issue. And it's a moral issue that in recovery, I mean, the whole concept of recovery means that you can totally recover. Actually, no, it doesn't. It means that we will always be in recovery, that you are never recovered. And therefore, when you're always in recovery, that means you always have to be drug-free. And this gets to be, and we're going to talk more about this when Professor Ahart comes here to talk about dual diagnosis. This presents real dilemmas sometimes when people who have dual diagnosis or co-occurring disorders, as we now call it properly, people who have psychiatric illnesses who have to be on medication because of their illnesses, or people who are in intractable pain and have to be on anti-pain meds, have problems with other drugs other than the pain medications. We want to see everybody drug-free. And what I'm going to ask you to think about, is that a reasonable suggestion for somebody who needs medications? And it's the idea, I mean, I don't have the answer to this. I honestly don't. But I think that what you're going to see is that we have much worse outcomes when we don't give people medications that they need for conditions that they have in the name of quote-unquote recovery. Because what that has associated with is an ideology that is not scientifically based. It's this notion that if you are addicted to one drug, you are necessarily addicted to all the drugs. Or that if you are addicted to one drug, that any other drug, let's say you stop using your drug of choice that you were addicted to, that any other drug is going to necessarily set off that addiction cycle again. So it becomes more a question of faith rather than science, because we don't know that that's true. And in fact, when it comes to properly using medications like methadone, and it's not always used properly, I want to be clear about that, but when medications are properly used, I think as social workers who are looking to alleviate stress, alleviate pain, ensure client better functioning, if better functioning comes from the use of a drug that is properly prescribed by a doctor, as opposed to a drug that they are taking illegally that contains God only knows what and putting in their veins, I think that, to me, it's a no-brainer. But it isn't to most people. And I just want us to recognize that this is a moral, philosophical issue. It's not a question of what works. What we have found consistently with methadone clinics is that you have better health outcomes. When people are properly taking methadone, properly taking it as prescribed and are staying off heroin, what we see is that their health gets better. They stop robbing the mom and pop stores. They stop breaking into your house and my house to get money to buy their drugs. They no longer have collapsed veins, unless they were already collapsed. There's no new incidence of the massive health and economic problems that we see with illegal drugs. So I think it's a question of what outcome are you trying to achieve? I think we really have to ask that. What outcome are you trying to achieve? Are you trying to achieve an outcome whereby the person is functioning better and is physically healthier, and their actions are no longer having a social and economic consequence on society? Or do we simply want people to be drug-free because we think that's the way that they should be? Does that make sense to y'all? Yeah, Ruth.
That's what I was going to ask. What is the purpose of this treatment? Is it to change somebody's behavior or to cure somebody from an addiction? If you're replacing the drug with another drug and all you want is a person to be good, or you want the person to be cured?
Well, what do you mean by cure?
Well, I guess somebody who's not addicted anymore, that is not just a behavior changing, but also there's other things in there, it's drug-free.
Okay, so you're saying cure means drug-free. Well, look around at all the people that you know in your life. Are they all drug-free? Totally drug-free?
Some of them are.
They never take an aspirin. They never get sick and need an antibiotic.
Well, yeah, but they're not taking methadone. So
Well, what that says, Ruth, is that we have put such a stigma on certain drugs, even when they have medical use that is approved and medical use that works, that drug is so stigmatized that we are not willing to look at it rationally. Does that make sense? So the idea of drug-free, let's start with that. We do not have a drug-free society. We simply don't. And we probably never will. Because and do you notice the language as well? Drug is something you shouldn't take, and medication is something that's just fine. But we talked about this, I think, the very first lecture, that the drugs that are psychoactive, whether they're legal or illegal, they work in the brain. And that includes all the drugs in psychiatry. So if we want people to be truly drug-free, we would not be able to treat the conditions that we have in psychiatry. Because I think, as we know, particularly with chronic schizophrenia, those folks have to be on medication for the rest of their lives. So if we set a goal for them to be drug-free, we're going to have a relapse of their symptoms. Does that make sense? Similarly, I think we just have to ask ourselves, are we going to take the moral position, and that's really what it is, that all drugs are bad and people should never take drugs? Or are we going to take the position that if a medication that we now call a drug and label as a drug, and again, that is simply the way we stigmatize drugs. If there is a medication that can help somebody, stop taking drugs that are dangerous, that are made in the streets, that they're shooting in their arm, that they have to do all kinds of drastic things to get money for, rather than going to a pharmacy or a clinic to fill a prescription. I think it's a choice of values that you have to make. Does that help? Yeah, Ashley?
I guess from my experience, I've seen methadone patients basically trade one set of problems from the opiates that they were addicted to a whole other set of problems. Even though those new set of problems are maybe healthier, they're still a whole new set of problems, and they're still financially strapped to purchasing that medication on a regular basis.
Well, and that says more about whether or not we are willing to give people the medications that they need at a reasonable price that people can afford. I think if you follow the research on methadone treatments, again, when you say one set of problems to another set of problems, okay, so they don't have money, but it's not the methadone that's causing them to not have money. Where it is for serious heroin users, what I would call the heroin junkie, it is the heroin that is making that person not function. It is the heroin that is making that person go out to the streets and rob and steal to get money to buy an illegal substance. So people have problems. If you take a look at the clients that we work with, folks, they wouldn't come to us if they didn't have problems. And we're never going to get rid of all of people's problems. And if the problem is that they are underemployed or unemployed, we need to look at the employment issue and not blame that on the drugs. Does that make sense?
It absolutely does, and these clinics don't address those other things to help them.
Yeah, and what you're going to hear from me is that one of the problems that I see that occurs in drug treatment is that we focus solely on the drugs and we do not focus on their psychosocial functioning separately. And we call it aftercare, and I'm going to be giving a lecture toward the end of the semester on treatment and aftercare. And aftercare passes as, are you going to meetings? And it doesn't address the whole person and his or her needs. So if you've got somebody who has been so dysfunctional and unable to work because of a drug habit, they need, to begin with, nutritional rehabilitation. They have been starving themselves to death. We're going to talk more about that in future lectures. But their nutrition is off, and we tend to not even look at that. They sometimes need education, they sometimes need job rehabilitation, and we don't pay attention to that. Our sole concern is getting them clean and sober. And yet we have these other biopsychosocial needs that we tend to ignore. So I'm not surprised when you say methadone clients, we trade one set of problems for another set, but I think we would have to acknowledge that this other set of problems typically is not as bad if they're using the drug correctly. Sure. Yeah. Matt, did you have your hand up?
Well, I was just going to say, with most of these, the drugs that we're talking about, we really are talking about behaviors.
Yes.
There are behaviors that we have a problem with. The fact is, there are people who drink, and that's socially acceptable until their behavior becomes socially unacceptable. So it's not a problem for people to drink unless they're getting DWIs, beating their kids, losing their jobs, not being responsible. And so like methadone might be an example, but there are probably other examples of like a drug substitute. The major focus is the negative, socially unacceptable behaviors. So if you address that, now I know there are going to be purists in AA or NA who would be like, oh, absolutely not, but it's like you wouldn't be here except for your behaviors. If some, magical thinking were true and you were able to use cocaine and not do all those things you did, guess what? You'd still be using cocaine.
And that's true. And in fact, if you take a look at the cocaine-using population, and we'll talk more about this in a later lecture, if you take a look at the drug-using population in general, it's a very small proportion of people who use drugs who are the really problematic users. However, those problematic users are very problematic, and they skew our notion about drug use. Depending on the drug, I would say for many drugs, the problematic users of the drug-using population, now some people just don't use drugs, period. Of the drug-using population, roughly 80%, and this is alcohol too, by the way, roughly 80 to 85% of the people who use most of these drugs tend to use them most of the time not problematically. Now, those ratios go up and down depending on the drug. The problematic users with psychedelics is extremely small, just a few percent. The problematic users with heroin, because it is so causes such physical dependence, is much larger. So what we're doing when we talk about drug use, and we're going to talk about this in a future lecture in a couple of weeks, I want you to understand the difference between drug use, drug misuse, drug abuse, and drug addiction, because they are not the same patterns. And what we tend to do now is that if we see a positive drug test or we see a drug present, we assume that it's drug abuse. We assume that it's drug addiction, and we do not do a careful assessment. Does that help sort that out a little bit? So again, I want us to be clear about which of these issues is a moral position about should we be using drugs to treat drugs. The shoulds and the should nots, those are moral positions, philosophical positions. You're following that? The does it work is a question of, is this effective rather than should we be using it? Do you understand those two differences? Anytime we say, should we do this, you're making a judgment, or we say we shouldn't do this, and we don't have data to show that it's ineffective. We're talking about a moral position about what our preference is. The shoulds and should nots have to do with preferences. The question of does whatever, fill in the blank, does X treatment work, that's something we can empirically show. Now, one would hope that the shoulds and should nots are based on what? Whether or not something is effective, right? Yes? And the should nots, we should not use it, should come from, well, this doesn't work, and therefore we have to discontinue it. Unfortunately, in the field of drugs and drug treatments, the shoulds and should nots come from a moral perspective about the drug and what we believe it does, rather than a specific treatment and whether or not it is effective. And I'm going to say that that's true not only for drug use, it's true in drug policy. If we were basing drug policy on what is effective, and we're going to have lots more discussion about this, we would not continue the policies that we have now. And we would look to other countries to see what policies achieve better outcomes. Then the question becomes, and this is an important one because it really is at the heart of what you're asking, the question becomes, what do we mean by better outcome? What is it you're hoping for? And that's where we get back to the shoulds and should nots. People shouldn't be using drugs. Well, they can use some drugs, but not other drugs. So therefore, it's okay to use Valium if you're anxious, but it's not okay to use Valium if you want to get high on it, or if you like the way it makes you feel. Same drug, but we have different attitudes about why people take drugs, whether they medically need it or not. Any questions? Does that make sense? Again, the shoulds and should nots, in my opinion, this is personal, should be based on whether or not something is effective. But that's not what the shoulds and should nots are based on. They're based on our overriding attitudes about certain classes of drugs, about certain drugs, not all drugs, because most of the drugs that are out in society, we say, fine, doctors can prescribe that. And through historical factors that have happened and policies that have been enacted over the years, there are certain drugs that we have come to fear so much. They have been demonized so much that we no longer see them as in the realm of possibility of drugs that people should use. Thankfully, those attitudes are somewhat changing, and particularly about funding for studies on drugs that we say people should never use to see whether or not they can be effective for certain kinds of medical conditions. Any questions about that? Any other questions from the lecture last week? Yeah, Amy.
I have a question about opiates. This question is from my placement, but
Okay.
I have callers that call that say that they're taking medications, SSRIs for depression or major depressive disorder, and yet they're also taking opiates. Are those drugs, when they're using them in combination, are they fighting for the same receptor sites?
No.
Okay.
Opiates have their own receptor sites, and there are several different receptor sites, but those are specific receptor sites that relieve pain. Those are very specific receptor sites for the opiates. The SSRIs are working specifically on serotonin reuptake. So there are different receptor sites. That doesn't mean that there isn't some interaction, but it's not the same receptor sites.
So to follow that up, are there medications that they're being prescribed by the doctor? Well, they're both being prescribed by doctors, but are they interfering with each other, or are they getting the benefits from their depression medication?
As with everything, it depends on dose. What did we say several weeks ago? Dose determines the effect. So I can't answer that question without knowing whether or not that doctor has enough knowledge to prescribe adequately and properly for the conditions that he or she is prescribing for. Clearly, if the dose is not high enough, the client is not going to get the effect. If the dose is too high, it's going to have adverse effects that are not meant to happen. And that is certainly one of the dilemmas, that many of these fairly potent medications are being prescribed by doctors who know very little about them. And in fact, there is a big push from big pharmaceutical companies to have regular medical doctors prescribe these drugs. Many of these drugs that used to be in the realm of psychiatrists only, or typically psychiatrists only, have now spilled over into general medical practice. And in fact, there is a big push by the pharmaceutical companies. There's an instrument called the Prime MD that was developed to help medical doctors, general practitioners, prescribe psychiatric medications. And who do you think paid for the development of the Prime MD? Come on, one guess, folks. Pharmaceutical. Yeah, you have to use the microphone. Pharmaceutical companies. So I really want you to see how these work hand in hand. Does that make sense? Okay. What I'd like to turn to today is there are 3 classes of drugs that we didn't finish last week, and I would like us to take a look at those very quickly. Actually, one I'm not going to talk about. I'm going to let Dr. Skolnick talk about nicotine because that's one of his specialties. But to the PowerPoint, John? Okay, we didn't talk about the hallucinogens, the psychedelic drugs. These are very diverse compounds, and sometimes there are drugs that get classified as hallucinogenic that really aren't hallucinogenic. These are very diverse compounds, and they do several things. They produce a heightened awareness of sensory input. In other words, all sensory input, everything that you see, hear, smell, touch, becomes extremely heightened. Another thing that they do, depending on dose and depending on the specific drug, is that they cause hallucinations. We talked about this last week, that rats will not go near these drugs. They don't like hallucinating. But people, when they take these drugs to hallucinate. They also give you an altered sense of reality. One of the things that is fairly common about all of the hallucinogens, the true hallucinogens, and we'll talk about that. By that I mean LSD, psilocybin, which are the magic mushrooms that grow wild in the cow patties up in Fort Worth, mescaline, which comes from the peyote cactus, and what we call the designer drugs. These are the chemically altered forms, STP, MDA, MMDA, and the most common one that is used now, which is ecstasy, which is MDMA. What these drugs do is they produce hallucinations. They produce a spiritual-like experience in making many people feel that they are at one with the universe, closer to God, whatever God is to the person who's taking the drug, and they feel as part of the universe. There's no other way to put it. Certain drugs, like ecstasy, do not cause hallucinations. You'll never get a visual hallucination with ecstasy or auditory hallucination. What you will get is a really heightened sense of empathy for everybody around you. heightened sense of empathy. Ecstasy is a very interesting drug because it's also chemically related to amphetamines, much more so than these other drugs are. So ecstasy, which is one of the drugs that young adults, teenagers and young adults tend to abuse at rave parties, and these are still going on. It is a drug that promotes closeness, emotional closeness, but it also gives you lots of energy because of the amphetamine part of it. So ecstasy is, in essence, the effects that you get is a combination of the amphetamines, which gives you the energy, combined with mescaline, which gives you not the mescaline can give you hallucinations in high doses. Ecstasy can't. What ecstasy does is that it makes you feel at one with the world and close to the people around you. So these are the ones that are what I call the true hallucinogens. Others that are put in the category of hallucinogenic drugs because they cause hallucinations, but they work on different receptors, are ketamine and PCP. Again, the primary effects of these drugs, you hallucinate. Altered perception, altered mood, altered thought, altered time. These drugs, most of them are fairly long-lasting. Particularly LSD, you're good for 10 to 12 hours. Mescaline, you can be good for 8 to 10 hours. Same thing with mushrooms. They give you a distortion of body image, time, and space. Euphoria. It's not the same kind of euphoria that you feel on cocaine. It's not the same kind of euphoria that you feel on heroin. But it is a different kind of euphoria where you feel at one with everything. And they also cause relaxation. These drugs are typically taken orally. If you read about LSD, LSD is a very complex drug, and it is, of all the drugs we're going to be talking about in this class, it is the most potent, the most potent. And what do we mean by that? Rather than being measured in milligrams, LSD is measured in micrograms. It takes very little to send you out to the moon, very little to get you very, very high. And LSD is one of the few drugs that is rarely adulterated with anything. And most typically today you're going to find it not in a pill form, but in what they call a blotter form, B-L-O-T-T-E-R, where they will infuse liquid LSD onto a piece of paper and then put a stamp on it so that you know which batch it is. That's how they identify LSD. And then it's cut up into little squares which people put under their tongue. They don't swallow it, but they take it sublingually underneath their tongue, and it gets into the blood vessels that way. Very, very powerful hallucinogen. The drug that people will smoke or snort is primarily PCP. It's rare to find people smoking or snorting any of the other hallucinogens. Mushrooms are either chewed on, they are rather vile tasting from what I am told, or they are infused into a tea that people can drink. Mescaline, you can chew on the actual peyote button, or it can come in a pill form if it's synthesized. The interesting thing about the hallucinogens is that tolerance to them is extremely rapid. Pharmacologically, the way that they work is they deplete the neurotransmitters relatively quickly. And therefore, tolerance becomes very, very rapid. And because the neurotransmitters get depleted fairly rapidly, it takes a while for the brain to restore its own neurotransmitters. It takes a while for it to do that. And therefore, what we never find is physical dependence. It's impossible to produce physical dependence on any of the hallucinogens, the pure hallucinogens. There are, and obviously, cross-tolerances to any other psychedelic drugs. Antagonists, very importantly, what do you do when somebody's on a bad trip? What can you do when somebody is on a bad trip? What we mean by bad trip, all of a sudden they get panicky, they get anxiety, they're afraid because they're hallucinating. They can have really horrible, horrible hallucinations. And what do you do to bring somebody down from a bad trip? Yeah, Matt?
Nothing.
Nothing, no.
There's nothing to do. I mean, that individual just has to experience that, which I think is one reason why a lot of people don't do it.
Actually, no, there are things that you can do to stop the hallucinations, or at least stop part of the panic attack and effects. Antagonists, serotonin antagonists such as thorazine or other antipsychotic drugs will help stop, at least partially, the really scary effects of it. Sometimes Valium gets used to calm people down, but it doesn't stop the hallucinations. But think about this. Thorazine is used, why? To stop hallucinations in psychotic patients, right? So we could also use it to mitigate the effects of the LSD. The other thing, and in a sense you're right, because most people don't have Thorazine on hand. Nowadays, some people might have Valium on hand, but mostly what you can do is talk somebody down from a bad trip. It takes caretaking. You've got to assure them they're safe. You've got to assure them that they are hallucinating, not because it's a real hallucination, but rather it's because of the drug that they just took. And essentially what you do is you talk somebody down. You put them in a safe place. And this is a problem, because if people are out partying doing these drugs, it's hard to get people in a place where they feel safe. So the more experienced users and the more serious, and there is a cadre of serious psychedelic users, they typically don't go out and party with these drugs. They use these for religious and spiritual experiences, and it's very different. It's very different. Any questions about the hallucinogens? LSD pretty much disappeared from the landscape, and the reason for that is that the cops arrested the person who was responsible for most of the LSD production in the early 2000s. I see reports that it's picking up again, so I'm not sure where it's coming from. Ecstasy is particularly problematic because it's made illegally, and most of what is out there being sold as ecstasy today either is heavily adulterated with other substances, or it's not ecstasy at all. So many of the so-called quote-unquote ecstasy deaths that we see have nothing to do with ecstasy. It's the other stuff that's in the pill that's called ecstasy. Okay, the other drugs we didn't talk about are inhalants. This is a very, very diverse group of solvents that are usually carbon-based compounds. What I'm going to do, I'm going to put a handout that I couldn't get onto PowerPoint. I'm going to put a handout onto Blackboard for you. An interesting story about where I got the handout. For many years while I was teaching this course, I tried to find information about the inhalants. That's the glue, the paint. We talked about this at the beginning of the semester, that are so dangerous, so very, very dangerous. That kids, they tend to huff it, they inhale it until they pass out. And there's all kinds of mythology about which gets you higher, the gold paint or the green paint. It has nothing to do with the color of the paint. It has to do with the specific psychoactive component that is in the paint. Some of these are alcohol-based, some of them are toluene-based, so it's, when I say very diverse, this is a very diverse group. Very commonly, it's things like paint thinner, gasoline, adhesives, things like glue. Model glue for airplanes was big until they put that behind the counter where you have to show proof of ID, and kids just can't walk in and get that. Rubber cement. I've seen kids sniffing whiteout, aerosol sprays. Very, very dangerous, can cause immediate damage to the brain. And of all the drugs, I think we talked about it. This is your brain on drugs. This is your brain on drugs. The handout, I spent a lot of time looking through textbooks for information on inhalants. I would typically find one or two sentences, maybe a paragraph, maybe a very thin chapter that didn't have much information. Years ago, Rolling Stone magazine, you're familiar with Rolling Stone, put out a book called How to Get Off Drugs. And in that book, I found an excellent handout on the inhalants. So I'm going to upload that to Blackboard for you because it wouldn't fit on a PowerPoint slide. And it's copyrighted. What do these drugs do? It's an intoxication that is very, very similar to alcohol. Except unlike alcohol, where people have some experience with alcohol, they see other people drinking, and you can somewhat tell how intoxicated you're going to get. What these kids tend to do is that they huff and they inhale these substances to the point that many times they simply pass out, which is extremely, extremely dangerous. So how is it administered? They inhale the vapors. In most of these, the tolerance is minimal, and there's cross-tolerance to similar substances. Do the people become physically dependent? It's possible for most. However, the withdrawal is relatively mild. The withdrawal is relatively mild. However, of all the drugs we're going to be talking about today, this is the one drug that has the most serious consequences for the user, particularly for the experimenter. You can cause fairly immediate brain damage. And if you've ever worked with kids who are huffers, you can see that they're not functioning well. They're not functioning correctly. Before we go to that, any questions about that? None? Okay. Don, we're going to go to break right now. Hello, I'm Dr. Susan Robbins. We're back with the second part of the class to Drugs and Society. Real pleased to have here today Professor Buford Terrell, who is a retired law professor who was at Texas Southern University for many years.
South Texas.
South Texas. You're at South Texas.
Yes.
Sorry. Back up. South Texas College of Law. And his teaching fields included drug laws, law and sex, First Amendment, and legal history. He also hosts a public interest television show in Houston called Drugs, Crime, and Politics, on which I have appeared. So please welcome Professor Terrell, and he's going to be talking to us about the history of drug and alcohol control.
Okay.
Let's have a round of applause. Come on, folks.
Thank you, Susan. It's good to be here. You know, history classes have a terrible but well-deserved reputation for being boring. To counteract that, I thought we might start tonight with a little trivia quiz. So if you think you know the answer, let's see. In his first term, President George Washington led federal troops against rebels in western Pennsylvania. Which psychoactive drug was at the root of this controversy? Yeah. Matt?
Whiskey.
Whiskey, yes. This was the notorious Whiskey Rebellion. The feds imposed an excise tax on distilled spirits to try to pay off the Revolutionary War debts. The farmers in western Pennsylvania grew corn, but had no roads to get corn to market, so they distilled it into whiskey, which they could carry in barrels on horseback. They rose up in revolt because they thought the tax would put them out of business. We'll move forward a little bit. Some of you may vaguely remember in the 1790 to 1805 or so, the U.S. was in a controversy with the Barbary pirates along the north shore of Africa. You may not remember the war, but you probably vaguely remember hearing the phrase, millions for defense, not sent for tribute. Why were American ships in the Mediterranean Sea at this time anyway? That one will probably stump you. I didn't find out the answer myself until a couple of years ago. Well, the answer is they were going after Turkish opium. Turkish opium was one of the major cash cargoes for American shipping up through at least the first half of the 19th century. In fact, the Yankee Clippers you've heard about sailing out of Boston would go to Turkey, buy opium, sail around Africa to China, trade the opium for silks, tea, and porcelain, finish going all the way around the world and get rich selling that stuff in Boston. This was the same thing the British were doing until the 20th century. And since we're now of the Civil War, think about it. The North had a fantastic navy, the South had none to speak of. Opium was the most valuable medicine during that war with battlefield casualties. Where in the world did the Confederate Army get its opium? Anyone know? Yes.
Mexico?
Nope. Yes, Amy.
The slave, from the slave captains from the slave ships?
Not from the slave ships, but you're closer with the idea of the slaves. The answer is they grew it themselves. In fact, in 1872, the State Board of Health of Massachusetts complained about white opium being grown in Vermont, or white poppies grown in Vermont and turned into opium. They admitted that most of that opium was consumed at home, but that hundreds of pounds were shipped into Boston. They further pointed out that there were large commercial sources providing opium to the Boston area in Florida and Louisiana. There were big growers in California and Arizona, and that a farmer in Arizona with just 10 acres could provide 1,200 pounds a year of opium. We'll talk about this when we get to the idea of source suppression. When and where was the first U.S. law against marijuana passed? And this one is kind of a trick question.
No ideas?
No ideas? Well, it's closer to home than you would think. El Paso, Texas, in 1912 or 1915, it was after the Mexican Revolution of 1910 that started the first major wave of Mexican immigration to the United States. I say it's a trick question because I just recently found out that California, a couple of years earlier, passed a law against Indian hemp, which is the same thing. But El Paso usually gets the credit, and they were the first one to actually use the word marijuana. In 1937, the United States passed the law that in effect outlawed marijuana. How many doctors testified to Congress to support that law? Yes.
One.
She did, I think. Well, actually, you're right in that one doctor testified, but he testified against the law. He said first that it wasn't needed, and second that he was afraid that it would cut off important medical research in the use of marijuana, particularly for pain relief and as an antispasmodic, which incidentally are the two major uses it has today. And when the law was passed in 1937, marijuana under the name cannabis was sold across the counter as medicine all across the United States anyway. And looking at that same law, how many people did the government's witness claim were using marijuana in 1937? Any guesses on that?
Come on, don't be a
You'll be surprised. Harry Anslinger, the head of the Bureau of Narcotics, said less than 100,000 people in the country were using it, and they were almost all Negro jazz musicians, to use his language, or Mexican agricultural laborers. So lately, I'm more and more convinced that that number is totally, absolutely, possibly at least an order of magnitude wrong, but it's hard to get the actual numbers to back it up. Well, moving forward, what's the latest government figure on how many people use marijuana? Any guess? Yeah.
Well, do you mean like have used or using on a current
Either
basis?
or both.
I would say probably current basis, I don't know, 50 million?
Well, you're a little short, but you're getting closer. The last full year's figures that I'm aware of, the government estimated that over 40% of all adult Americans, which would be over 100 million people, had used it at least once, and that over 15 million used it at least once a month. So if in 70 years the marijuana laws have suppressed the use of marijuana from 100,000 to 100 million, I'm not sure how many more successes like that we can afford. Switzerland started giving maintenance heroin to established addicts in the mid-90s. How many people in Switzerland have died of an opioid overdose? Started that program. Okay, again.
I'll take a wild guess. None.
That's not only a wild guess, that's exactly the correct guess. They have not had a single person die of an opioid overdose since they started the maintenance program. Now, granted, all of Switzerland probably has fewer opioid addicts than Houston does, but it's still a pretty good record. People hear about major traffickers. I'm not talking about wholesale. I'm not talking about vicious crimes.
250,000?
I'm in the ballpark this time. I'll have a guess here. actually over 800,000, probably closer to 875,000. And at the same time, have a lot of law enforcement that, well, in this country, we're not sending anyone to jail for marijuana. Then why are we busting that many? California passed the first state medical marijuana law in 1996. How many states have medical marijuana laws now? Anyone else want to try? Sarah, you act like you're trying to make a guess there.
11?
That's not too far off. Right now, it's 14. And there are at least 3 or 4 states that have it under active consideration. So, was anyone surprised by this little set of trivia? And, you know, in my life, it's pretty wasted, but I have spent a lot of time learning things, some of them rather hard things. I've worked through some different branches of advanced mathematics, organic chemistry, and I'll admit that one almost got me. At one time, I was able to do computer programming in 4 different languages. Anyone who accepts law as a profession is in a full-time educational program. There's no doubt about that. But the 15 years I have now spent looking at drug policy and drug laws has to be the most fascinating and frustrating learning experience I have ever had. And the main reason is that more than a learning process, it's been an unlearning process. And this is kind of a fair warning to you that virtually everything you think you know about drugs, drug usage, drug policy, drug laws is wrong. And what's even more frustrating, one of the places we tend to turn to for good, solid, reliable information is the federal government. Until you start looking at drugs and drug policy. And the frustrating thing is most of the government's information on drugs is just as wrong. Now, some of it, poor methodology, and some of that they couldn't help. Some of it, they had the wrong assumptions going into it, and with the wrong assumptions, you always ask the wrong questions. But worse than that, part of the time they intentionally mislead, and what's even worse, sometimes they just out and out lie. One figure that a lot of people took as solid was the federal government claimed that heroin addiction was down to about 20,000 people in the late 1930s. Professor Cortland, a few years back, did some Freedom of Information actions, got the material, and found out that that number was frankly just an absolute made-up lie. And there's no nice way to say it. So part of the problem here is that where we would normally look to get the truth on something, we find that the people we count on to give us the truth are instead feeding us a bunch of nonsense. So that's part of the problem we have here. And interestingly enough,
Do you need some help with that?
no, I've got it now. I've found that to some extent, the people that you normally don't trust turn out to be pretty reliable. 2 sources that I turn to quite a bit. We've all heard, don't trust Wikipedia on anything. But for technical information about drugs, it's a pretty solid source. If I'm really interested, I'll go from there to the footnotes and trace it back to the original sources, the studies, but just as what in the world is, for instance, marijuana. Their starting articles are pretty good and they're well footnoted. The other great source is Erowid, EROWID.org. That was kind of a freelance project that got started. They've collected information about almost all of the drugs that anyone has ever tried just for the hell of it. They have some of the scientific evidence and a lot of reports of personal experiences. So those are really the two places I have found are best to see what we're going to do. But if we go back...
I'd like to add to that, Drug Policy Alliance website also has excellent information.
Yes, Drug Policy Alliance website is very good. And actually there are now literally hundreds of well-established, credible drug sites out there. I picked those two out because most people don't know about them, and for information about the drugs themselves, they're solid. Well, let's go back and look how we got here. If we look at pre-Civil War America, there were two drugs that were imported. Those are opium and alcohol. Most of the estimates suggest that on a per capita basis, Americans in the Revolutionary to 1800 period were consuming more alcohol per capita than at any time since then. And this next number is strictly my opinion because I haven't been able to find hard data to back it up. But if we look at the state of the world in about 1800 to 1850, there was no dentistry to speak of. We've all heard tales about George Washington's false teeth and John Adams without any teeth at all. So practically everyone had toothaches. It was back in the days before modern surgery, and you men out there are still too young to know much about this, but something that all older men dread and many experience is bladder stone as well as kidney stone. Excruciatingly painful. Ben Franklin spent his last 20 years with bad kidney stones and took opium almost every day for it. The third thing, until after 1840 and the problem with cholera in London, no one had made the connection between public drinking water and illness. So until that took over, all of the intestinal diseases were rampant. So if you combine the fact that opium was the only decent pain reliever and that it was and still is one of the most effective cures for the diarrheal diseases, my own sense is that in this period of time, everyone used opium. As I say, there's no hard numbers to back this up. I used to think there were some. In about 1840, America passed a law that kept records of all of the opium that was imported into the country. And most of us kind of swore by those numbers as being really hard data about how much opium was here. But more and more, like the thing I quoted earlier, I'm finding out how much was grown in the United States that wouldn't have been accounted for that way. Now, in the 1820s, scientists learned how to separate opium, which is the primary active ingredient of opium, separate it out, purify it. By about 1840, they had also invented the syringe. so that morphine could be used intravenously, as well as the opium that was still taken usually in an elixir, an alcohol solution that was swallowed. So we find that morphine starts moving in to replace opium. We also find, starting in about 1820 or so, that people began to organize against alcohol. The second great awakening of an American religious revival started at about that time, that led to most of the modern non-traditional old-line Protestant churches. It was the source of most modern fundamentalism and Pentecostalism. The emphasis there, as opposed to 100 years earlier, was the idea of self-betterment and self-improvement. And so they started picking on alcohol, because alcohol was a mind-altering drug, and you couldn't keep yourself from sin if you didn't have control of your wits. By 1840s, when the potato blight hit Ireland and new waves of immigrants, first Irish, then Italians, then Jews, then Russians and Poles, started swarming the country, we have an anti-foreign element coming into play. And these were all societies that used alcohol socially, and particularly in the cities where these people congregated, whereas most of the now nativist so-called Americans were more small-town people. The social center for these people that didn't have much home space was the local saloon. So we have things like the American First Party or the Know Nothing Party, basically wanted to get rid of all foreigners, combining with the Anti-Saloon League and later the Women's Christian Temperance Union to close down saloons. By the end of the 19th century, Prohibitionism was a major social movement. By the time we actually get around to national prohibition, over half the states had adopted their own prohibition laws. Some of them, in fact, still have them. But we have, with this coming together of xenophobia and religious no mind altering coming together by about 1840 to 1850, a very, very strong, puritanically based, anti-drug, and here I'm including alcohol, movement. The Civil War changed a lot of things in this country. For one thing, a lot of people got hurt in the Civil War. And if you figure the number of people that took severe casualties, the number of amputations there were a lot of military people who suffered severe pain and continue to suffer pain. I talked to this once to a physician who specializes in pain management. And he pointed out to me that neuropathic pain from amputations is still one of the most difficult kinds of pain to treat. And he said, if you look at the state of surgery during the Civil War, it's surprising there weren't 10 times as many suffering from it. So morphinism, or alcohol or opiate addiction, became known as the old soldier's disease. And I heard of at least one example, because of field sanitation conditions and the use of opium as an antidiuretic, where at least one Union commander lined his troops up every morning after reveille and had them slug down a prophylactic dose of opium to prevent getting diarrhea. And if you do that to a group of soldiers for 3 or 4 years, you're going to get some addicts out of the group. So we have this group of military people who are really pressed into the use of opium, and the doctors don't know much about it, so they end up, many of them, becoming addicted. We also have cocaine making its first appearance. It's isolated by about 1870, and doctors think that it's a miracle drug. And in many ways it is. Except it's pretty easy to overdose on cocaine and go wild or get strung out. Sigmund Freud was the first medical man to really push cocaine. One of his associates started using it, started using way too much of it, ended up dying prematurely. In the United States, our classic story is Dr. William Halsted, a young, brilliant New York doctor who started experimenting with the brand new cocaine, ended up hooked on it, decided that he wanted to get rid of it so he could get on with his life. He took the newest remedy that had hit the medical field in the 1890s, a brand new, quote, non-addictive drug called heroin. Well, sure enough, it cured his cocaine habit, but he found himself really thoroughly hooked on opiates. This was while he was still in his 20s. While he was an opiate addict, he became one of the founders of Johns Hopkins Medical School and Johns Hopkins Hospital. He remained chief of surgery at that hospital until his death in 1922. He invented many surgical procedures still in use today. He was the one that developed the use of rubber gloves. His wife was a surgical nurse. Her hands couldn't stand up to the liquid disinfectants they used. So to save his wife's hands, he invented rubber gloves. So he continued this really over 20 years as chief of surgery of the greatest hospital in the country, while his colleagues supervised his daily injections of either morphine or heroin. But cocaine came in another way. Yes?
I'm sorry, could you repeat his name?
Halsted, Halstad. William Halsted. And by the way, last week I saw a brand new biography of him. I haven't bought it yet, but...
When you want him to go back to the PowerPoint, just tell him PowerPoint, then say back to me, so you can go back and forth.
Okay. The American society in the period after the Civil War had moved away from the East Coast, away from establishment medicine, away from medical schools, and as they moved to the frontier, they moved away from doctors, and the people that call themselves doctors usually were just people that hung up a shingle that said doctor on it. The result was that the American public became victim of patent medicines. And if you drive around the city and look at all of the damned health food stores we've got, they still are. But these patent medicines didn't have required labels on them. No one knew what was in them. Sure enough, when we go back and look, the major ingredients and the things in them that made people feel better were alcohol, opium, and cocaine. And as people used the patent drugs, particularly stay-at-home housewives, these patent drugs ended up hooking them on opium as well. And the cocaine part, cocaine in small doses is a great tonic. A Frenchman developed a way to fortify wine with cocaine, called his product Vin Mariani. It was a big seller worldwide. Advertisements of endorsement include those showing such notables as Thomas Edison and the Pope. But Prohibition was striking United States. A Southern druggist named Pemberton figured out that if you couldn't sell wine in the South, you couldn't sell Vin Mariani. You needed something that was a good cocaine tonic without the alcohol. His product was called Coca-Cola. And Coca-Cola was a coca or cocaine fortified beverage. So we have here patent medicines, veterans, cocaine, and heroin was introduced. It was really used both as a cure for opium and morphine addictions, and gee, it does that. A cure for cocaine addictions, it will do that too, and a fantastic painkiller. In fact, its main use until the 1930s, while it was still legal in most parts of the world, was as a cough suppressant for tubercular patients. And until they came up with drugs that could cure tuberculosis, it was great. It was nearly necessary. And one other thing that happened during this time was that in the Spanish-American War, the United States invaded the Philippines. They took sovereignty over the Philippines in that war. The Philippines had, for a long time, had licensed opium shops for the Chinese expatriates living in the Philippines. So here, all of a sudden, the United States was running a government that was set up selling opium to some of its immigrants. After the beginning of the 20th century, several things happened. First, the opioid problem was becoming severe enough that many communities, starting with Jacksonville, Florida, opened up city-run medical clinics in which opiate addicts, most of them at that time morphine addicts or patent medicine users, could go to the clinic and get maintenance doses, and those that wanted to try to quit the habit, they would try to help them wean away from it. Otherwise, they would just maintain them. This also included private clinics run by doctors for profit. Houston actually had a heroin clinic open up in 1919. I haven't been able to find out yet whether it actually treated any patients or not. It closed down rather quickly, but it did open. Now, between the mess with the patent medicines and the things that were appearing in the food market, the nation got up in arms over safety and cleanliness. Congress reacted by passing the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906. This required all manufacturers and vendors of food or medical products to put full disclosure labels on their products so that the consumer could simply read the label and know what was in it. Surprisingly enough, it worked. Between the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act and the passage of the Harrison Narcotics Act, opiate use in this country steeply declined. We also, because of anti-Chinese sentiments on the West Coast, passed the Smoking Opium Exclusion Act that prevented any opium prepared for smoking in pipes from being imported into this country. It's kind of ironic because smoking opium is diluted so that it's only about 7% or so morphine, whereas pure opium, as it comes from the flower, is more like 10%. So we were allowing the hard stuff to be imported, but we were keeping out the weak stuff. as the U.S. grappled with its problem in the Philippines, they appointed a commission that was chaired by an Episcopalian bishop who was one of the leading prohibitionists in the country at the time. He was horrified at the idea that the U.S. government would be selling opium to anyone. He was horrified particularly that the Chinese were using as much opium as there were. The United States was feeling expansionist and feeling like a big boy on the international trade scene. They wanted to try to break Britain's monopoly of the Chinese trade, which was largely based on importing opium from India to China. So the United States called for the first international conference on opium in 1909. Surprisingly enough, the British agreed to come. And they also entered into an agreement with the revolutionary Chinese government at the time to phase out their shipping of opium to China in 10 years. And believe it or not, they did it voluntarily. They agreed to hold another opium conference in 2 years. They did, and the second opium conference was an agreement to disagree. Everybody agreed something should be done, but nobody was willing to do anything. They ended up passing a very vague resolution that before the next opium conference came around, each of the governments would pass some sort of domestic opium law. But at about this time, a new drug shows up on the American scene. Shows up in about 1910 to 1915, and that's marijuana. And I've loved digging into the history of marijuana because it's really a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde character. One of the primary crops in Western Europe and America until the 20th century has been hemp. If you think about the old sailing ship Navy, every one of those ships had miles of rope and acres of sails. They were all made from hemp. During British colonial days in this country, farmers were required by law to grow hemp for the British Navy. But hemp plants have been crossbred for fiber, and especially length of fiber, so they're not really psychoactive. You can't get high on them. Second, cannabis as a medicine has an extremely long history in South and East Asia. In 1830s, a British doctor with the British Army in India wrote some medical journal articles about the use of cannabis in traditional Indian medicine. This started importing cannabis from India to Europe and a little bit to the United States for medicine from about 1840 on. It never became a bestseller. It never was really popular, but it was there. Then when Napoleon's army retreated from Egypt, they took hashish, or marijuana resin, back with them. They learned it from the Egyptians. By the 1820s, eating hashish was a fad movement among the literary groups in Paris. A little bit of it leaked over into the United States. In the very, very large eastern cities, there were a handful of hashish clubs for a very small handful of upper-class users. But nobody knew anything about it. But in the 1830s, the British Empire outlawed slavery in all of the British Empire. This left the Jamaican sugar planters without anyone to work their crops. The easiest place for them to find new salaried labor was in the British Empire in India. So they imported Indian laborers to work the sugar plantations, mainly in Jamaica. And these Indians brought with them Indian hemp, which they had used both religiously and recreationally. And sure enough, the two English language words for Indian hemp that they brought with them were bhang and ganja. So when you hear Bob Marley singing and he mentions ganja, he's using an Indian word. When the United States built the Panama Canal, they imported most of their laborers from Jamaica and Cuba because they tended to be immune to yellow fever. They took the ganja with them to Panama. It spread up into Mexico. The Panamanian shipping went mainly to New Orleans, so marijuana showed up in the New Orleans port. I've already mentioned the Mexican Revolution moved Mexican workers into the American Southwest, and they brought not ganja but marijuana with them. When I was a little bitty kid, I didn't speak Spanish, but I learned a Mexican folk song, La Cucaracha. Have any of you ever sung La Cucaracha? Do you know why the
Yes.
cockroach was sad? Anybody? Se falta marijuana por fumar. He was sad because he had no marijuana to smoke. So we have marijuana showing up in about the 1915 period. By 1920 or so, it was following the jazz musicians up the Mississippi River to Chicago. By the end of the 20s, a white saxophone player in South Chicago named Mizrael claims that he was the man that took marijuana to Harlem. I really have my doubts about it, but it makes a good story. And it's one of the reasons why I doubt that 100,000 figure. There's a newspaper picture from the middle 30s showing the New York police burning 30,000 pounds of marijuana that they confiscated in a raid in the middle 30s. Now, I have seen some pretty heavy using musicians, but 30,000 pounds will support a whole lot of jazz players. Louis Armstrong was arrested for marijuana possession in Los Angeles in 1931. A young man named Detroit Red made his living in the early 1940s selling marijuana to the musicians in Harlem and even followed them around on their tours on the East Coast. He claims his supply were the crew members of the shipping coming into New York, usually from the Caribbean. Now, Detroit Red later changed his name. We know him mainly as Malcolm X. So somehow by the 1940s, marijuana's all over the place. But the big change, one of the big changes in American law happened back in 1914. The government felt like it had to do something with this promise it had made to the International Opium Congress. It needed an American opiate law. They sent some investigators out. They discovered that, hey, cannabis was no problem. Their investigators said they found, I think it was 7 cannabis preparations for sale in the drugstores. 4 of these were for external application, mainly as corn plasters. So they left cannabis out. They instead covered opiates, which primarily would have been opium, morphine, and heroin, and cocaine. It imposed a very stiff tax to anyone who was not a doctor or a pharmacist. It allowed doctors and pharmacists to distribute these drugs in the course of their professional conduct. And it was enforced by the Treasury Department. And actually, contrary to what most people claim, it was reasonably effective. Heroin use cut down somewhat, although injections started. Injections were necessary because it was harder to find large quantities of pure stuff, and where you can snort pure heroin, if you've got little bits of the really, really weak stuff, you have to inject it to get the full effect. Cities were still running their maintenance clinics, but then in 1920, all hell broke loose. The 18th Amendment to the Constitution was passed, outlawing the manufacture, transportation, or sale of alcohol. This was enforced by the Volstead Act passed by Congress, effective in 1920. Now, I think it's important when we're talking modern drug policy to remember that alcohol prohibition was not truly prohibition like we think about it. It actually was more like what we now talk about in terms of marijuana as decriminalization, in that the federal law never made it illegal to possess or use alcohol. In fact, under prohibition and even today, you can still, for your own use, manufacture and keep a reasonable amount of wine and beer. I mean, you can't make truckloads of wine, but I forget, several gallons. The same with beer. Alcohol was always available on medical prescription. It was always available to churches for use in ritual and ceremony, including Jewish home use and things like the Seder. So it was far from the kind of all-out prohibition that we think of today. A lot of the really concerned dries were afraid that when the alcohol tap was cut off, all of the desperate lushes would immediately start shooting up on heroin. So they decided something was going to have to be done. They were getting dissatisfied with the maintenance clinics because, frankly, doctors didn't know what they were doing. The first journal on addiction medicine was started in 1959. It was only in the 1980s, after powerful computers were invented, that we came up with. So basically, before about 1980, we didn't know anything at all about the brain, the way it worked, or neurochemistry. So here back in the 1920s, these guys were fumbling around, they had goodwill, they didn't know. So they decided that they would have to crack down on heroin because they were cracking down on alcohol. And if you want to cry and hear a totally misguided individual, look for a copy of the speech that the evangelist Billy Sunday gave that's called John Barleycorn's Funeral. When Prohibition was passed, he preached this fantastic funeral sermon about how the jails would immediately empty, how all of the prisons could be shut down, how domestic violence would disappear completely. We would be in the greatest world imaginable. Guess what? It didn't happen. We instead got Al Capone. Prohibition laws do not and cannot work. And I define a prohibition law as any time a block in a functioning voluntary market. We usually think about alcohol prohibition or drug prohibition, but think about it. The laws against prostitution are a prohibition law. They have never worked. The laws against abortion are a prohibition law, and they have never worked. the laws keeping you from trading copies of recorded songs with your friend is a prohibition law, and it doesn't work either. Now, it may adjust the price of things. It definitely is going to cause corruption among law enforcement. It's probably going to degrade the quality of the product so that now you might die instead of getting good, pure heroin. But it's not going to stop the traffic. Just ask your friends in Mexico right now. So we have organized crime coming in. We have, for instance, the poster child for organized crime, Al Capone, organizing in Chicago. But he probably wasn't nearly as big as Nicky Arnstein in New York or many of the others. And the signal event was probably the St. Valentine's Day massacre in Chicago, where members of Capone's crew, dressed up in police uniforms that they got from legitimate policemen, busted into a garage used by a different gang and machine gunned everyone in there. That's what happens when the market goes undercover. I'm not aware of a single instance where Anheuser-Busch and Miller's have had a shootout over markets. But we have organized crime growing. By 1925, the federal prison, which was still a very small institution, a few thousand people, a third of the people in federal prison were there for alcohol violations. A third were there for drug law violations, and a third were there for everything else. Now, when you have this kind of situation going, especially with the money involved, one of the things that's always involved is law enforcement corruption. They used to say, and I'm sure it was highly exaggerated, that every cop in Chicago was on Capone's payroll. I don't know that. I do know that by the time Prohibition ended in 1933, over a third of the Bureau of Prohibition had been either convicted and sent to prison, fired, or forced to resign because of corruption. In 1930, the director of that agency had to resign when it was discovered that his son-in-law and his nephew were both on Nicky Arnstein's payroll. Now, Prohibition also caused some other things. A lot of New York restaurants closed down because you don't make much money selling food. You make the money selling wine to go with the food or cocktails beforehand. The old New York musical comedy kind of theater closed down. These were replaced with the speakeasy and the cabaret that became the modern nightclub. We had a dramatic change of social and entertainment policies. But it didn't work, and people realized it didn't work. So in 1933, the Constitution was changed to unamend the 18th Amendment and repeal Prohibition. But Prohibition had done a horrible thing. It had set people's mind to think about alcohol as demon rum. Alcohol was a bad actor. Alcohol slipped up and grabbed people by the throat and killed them. It wasn't what people did by drinking alcohol that was a problem. You could be the sweetest, nicest angel on earth, and that demon rum could still get you. Well, they started applying this kind of thinking to heroin. The Treasury Department first threatened and then prosecuted doctors for prescribing maintenance dosage of heroin or morphine to patients. The Supreme Court turned them down once. Then after the Volstead Act was passed, they went back the Supreme Court, in one of its more ridiculous decisions, said it's beyond argument that giving drugs to an addict is not the profession of medicine, and upheld the conviction. In 1925, the case came in front of the court again, the Littner case, and the court said regulation of the practice of medicine is delegated under the Constitution to the states, not to the federal government. And that's still the law today. That was the law behind the Food and Drug Administration, which was set up. And contrary to myth, the Federal Drug Administration does not approve drugs. It has no authority to say whether something is or is not good medicine. All it does is approve a label so that a drug can be marketed. And as recently as, I think, 2005, in the Oregon-assisted suicide case, the Supreme Court repeated this, that the federal government does not control the practice of medicine. That's up to the states. But even so, the Prohibition folks closed down all of the maintenance clinics. The last one in Baton Rouge was closed in 1925. Congress passed 3 laws in the 1925. The first one prohibited the import of heroin in the United States. That didn't really upset anyone because they would just import either raw opium or morphine. American manufacturers would convert it to heroin. They would then legally export this heroin to Canada, who was learning its lesson well as a rum-running source anyway. The Canadians would smuggle the heroin across the border into the United States, and it would hit the black market. So the Second Heroin Act forbade the export of heroin as well as the manufacture. Then they passed a really vicious law which made the mere status of being an opiate addict a federal crime. And along with this, they opened up 2 federal narcotics farms. They at least had the graciousness to be too embarrassed to call them the prisons they really were, so they called them farms. People convicted of opiate possession, primarily heroin, would be sent to these federal institutions. They provided ways in which people could voluntarily commit themselves in hope of being cured. And frankly, most of our basic research on addiction took place in these narcotics farms. They did some groundbreaking, now in hindsight rather horrific, experiments in the 30s and 40s. This changed after the Second World War, after the Nuremberg trials, when we found out what some of the German doctors had been doing in the concentration camps. American medicine got together and adopted some rather rigorous controls on human experimentation. And a lot of the stuff that we had been doing up until that time wouldn't anywhere near pass muster today. I mean, like doping the breakfast of every child in an orphan asylum just to see what the effect would be. Taking all of the blacks in a southern prison, black men, if they had syphilis, withhold all treatment from them just to see how the disease would progress. Well, these were the things that we quit doing in about 1950. So it cut off a lot of the experimental work that the narcotics firms were doing. Although some of the stuff, their idea that about 85% of those that complete therapy relapse within a year still pretty much holds true. They did the research that experienced addicts cannot tell the difference between injections of morphine and heroin, for instance. Then later in 1962, the federal government held that status crimes like being an addict, being an alcoholic, being a vagrant, that these status crimes were unconstitutional, that you could only be convicted of a crime for doing something, not for being something. This shut down the prison farms completely. Their staff of doctors and research techniques morphed into what is now the National Institute for Drug Abuse. And one of the interesting social events that happened in the 1920s, there were a lot of big-name, powerful people that made fortunes going around the country preaching about the evils of alcohol and promoting prohibition. When prohibition was repealed, these guys didn't give up and go home. They just took their speeches, scratched out alcohol or booze, and wrote in narcotics or heroin. The result was that by the 1940s, almost all of the dialogue about drugs in this country was being conducted in the language of the prohibitionists of the 1910s and 20s. And I know it still tickles me to go do a speech at a Rotary Club or something, and in the question period, some guy will stand up and say, "But do we really want these mind-altering drugs around?" I mean, this mind-altering phrase has been part of the religious movement since the 1820s. Well, anyway, the federal government was under pressure from the states. Between 1890, roughly, and 1930, the population of the United States living on the farms dropped from over 50% still to down to about 5%. It's now down to under 1%. Two things happened. The most important was the horse was replaced by the gasoline engine. And it's a good thing, too, because in about 1900, New York City streets were accumulating more than 5 million pounds of horse manure a day. But over half of the productive cropland in the United States was going to breed and feed all of those horses. And as the car and the truck replaced the horse, that cropland wasn't necessary to grow oats anymore. Between 1920, when war demand ended, and 1925, about half of the cropland of the United States came out of production. And the agricultural states were hurting because they had let all of these Mexican workers come in to work those crops. And now their natives couldn't make a living farming. They had all of these Mexican nationals there. The Southwest started passing anti-marijuana laws as a way to get rid of the Mexican laborers. Colorado was one of the first. Some of the newspaper editorials talking about the drug-crazed Mexicans running rampage and raping white women are just horribly vicious. But these states, as the Depression came on, tried to get federal help to enforce these basically anti-Mexican laws. The head of the Bureau of Narcotics resisted. He had a force of about 300 agents. He didn't want to get any bigger because he didn't like calling political attention to what he was doing. But the pressure got too strong to resist. And when the Federal Machine Gun Act, which was tax-based prohibition, was approved by the Supreme Court, the Treasury gave in to the political pressure from all of these states, and the result was the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. It was to some extent based on the old Harrison Act, but it didn't allow nearly as much room for medical use. Then by 1940, at that time the U.S. Pharmacopoeia, the official registry of drugs, was edited by one man. It wasn't a panel, there wasn't any kind of refereeing system. The head of the Narcotics Bureau convinced this man, who was against botanical medicines anyway, to pull cannabis out of the USP. He did. Then in 1952 actually, Congress passed the Boggs Act, which in effect treated marijuana just like heroin. In 1957, they passed the Narcotics Control Act, which for the first time applied the death penalty to any narcotics trafficking and made much stricter controls. However, they were still both tax-based acts. And when Timothy Leary, the LSD guru, was convicted and sentenced to 30 years for possessing, I think it was one marijuana joint, his case was appealed to the Supreme Court. The Supremes declared the Marijuana Act unconstitutional because requiring someone to fill out an application for a marijuana tax permit made them give their name and admit they were doing an illegal act, and it violated the privilege against self-incrimination. So the Marijuana Act was thrown out. Status crimes, as I say, were thrown out. The government was kind of desperate. But something else had been happening at the same time. In the mid-1930s, sulfa drugs were miracle drugs. They cured a lot of things, including tuberculosis. But they were in powder form and hard to use. One of the pharmacy companies decided to make a liquid version. They dissolved sulfa in ethylene glycol. Most of you may have heard of it as automobile coolant. And if you have, you know there's a big warning, don't let your pets eat it. That's because, just like the dog that laps up the spilled antifreeze in your garage, the people that took the sulfa dissolved in glycol died. People said something should be done. There had been other problems in the 20s and 30s, particularly with radiation-based tonics, for one thing. Take a slug of radium water every day. You won't get sick. Of course, you may glow in the dark and you'll probably die, but we won't tell you that. So the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act created the Food Drug Administration. At the same time, we have pharmaceuticals coming on like gangbusters. Amphetamine was invented in 1930. Penicillin was developed in the 30s and hit big time during World War II in the 40s. In the 50s, we have the first effective psychoactive drugs coming along, the antipsychotics, the major tranquilizers, and we have interest shown both medically and artistically to the psychedelics. First it was psilocybin, that's the magic mushrooms drug, and mescaline, which is peyote. We have in 1953 Aldous Huxley, the great British novelist, writing his Doors of Perception about his first experiences with psilocybin. We have LSD discovered in Switzerland just before World War II, and after the war, Sandoz, which owned the patent, started distributing it to doctors to find out if it was good for anything, and that was the way drugs were tested then. You simply gave free samples to doctors who would try it if they thought it could work. That was how amphetamines were first tested. And do you know the best thing that doctors found amphetamines were good for in the 30s? It let nurses and residents get through long, boring overtime shifts. And it also incidentally had minor effects on some depression. But a lot of doctors started experimenting with LSD in the middle 50s. The CIA and the Army particularly thought that it could be either a great truth serum, or you might slip it into the water supply of an enemy city so the whole city would go nuts, or you could give a little to the ruler of the other country or to the general of the other army, and he'd act crazy and people would lose confidence in them. So they started doing a lot of experiments with it. Totally out of control, off the wall. One CIA operative even rented an apartment in San Francisco, hired a prostitute to invite men up, slip him a tab of acid without his knowing it, and the CIA would film the entertainment. One of the few deaths ever associated with LSD came out of the Army experiments. They were in the habit of dosing their own employees just to see what would happen. They gave acid unknown to a scientist working for the Army. He tripped out, freaked out a little bit. He recovered, and a couple of months later, he supposedly jumped out of his hotel room in New York City. For years, that was the classic acid death. A couple of new CIA histories came out 4 or 5 years ago that suggest he was helped out of that window. That he was threatening to go public with what he knew about the LSD experiments, and the CIA felt like this couldn't be allowed. Now, did the CIA kill him? I don't know. I find it highly unlikely that a bad LSD trip would cause someone to suicide. We have, in the mid to late 50s and early 60s, the three big names pushing LSD. Aldous Huxley, who moved from psilocybin into acid. We have Timothy Leary, who was a research psychologist associated with Harvard, giving psilocybin to prison inmates and doing therapy, hoping to turn them into nice choir boys. He was introduced to acid by Allen Ginsberg and fell in love. Among other things, he took a bunch of seminary students, put them in the basement of a church during an Easter service, and they all tripped out so he could get the reaction of seminarians to Easter on acid. He was invited, let's say, to leave Harvard. He was just a lecturer, so there weren't any tenure issues or anything. He was given the use of a large estate in New York, Millbrook, where he held on for several years. An associate of his, Alpert, left Harvard at the same time, went on one of these find yourself pilgrimage for several years, came back from India as Ram Dass, pretty well got out of the drug movement and was just into meditation. And then on the West Coast, a graduate student was writing his first novel, working at a mental hospital, and volunteered for some drug experiments. His first novel was about that experience, working in the mental hospital, called One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Ken Kesey became rich. He used a lot of his money to help his friends have fun. They started having the acid trips in San Francisco, where they would hold parties for thousands. get some of their favorite house bands like Jerry Garcia and the Dead, or Country Joe and the Fish with Janis Joplin. They would, in effect, mix up a gigantic vat of Kool-Aid and pour acid in it and let everyone trip out. They did this dozens of times, mainly around San Francisco, but up down the East Coast. He decided it was time to spread the word. Bought a bus, school bus, painted in psychedelic colors, named it Further, spelled with a U, and took his merry pranksters, as he called them, on a cross-the-country bus tour to go visit Timothy Leary. Kesey's bunch and Leary's bunch didn't get along at all. Leary was serious, religious, focused on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, looking for who knows. Kesey wanted to have fun. He turned around and drove west again. Incidentally, one of those little things to hang up, Jack Kerouac wrote the definitive beatnik novel, On the Road. In this, the main protagonist was a character named Dean Moriarty. In real life, Dean Moriarty was a car thief out of Denver who became a brakeman on the Southern Pacific and was in on the San Francisco drug scene when it broke loose. Neil Cassidy was the bus driver on Further. My way of viewing it is that the last beatniks got on the bus and the first hippies got off the bus. In 1966, the CIA had given up on LSD, so they got Congress to outlaw it. Bang, just outlaw it completely. But shortly after that, a variation based on amphetamines but not acting quite like them showed up. MDMA, first known as Adam, known most of the time since then as ecstasy, showed up by the middle 70s, and still probably use would be measured in the millions of doses a week in this country. Likewise, we have all sorts of other designer drugs, chemicals that are altered enough so that they don't fit under the law but still do more or less the same thing. There are dozens of them. The law, as it was adopted, had a provision to cover all of these workalikes. And what we find is that in 1970, our current law was passed. It was the Controlled Substances Act. And it was actually only one part of a much broader statute. The first part covered controls over manufacturing, distribution, inventorying, prescription of the controlled substances. The third part dealt with international law and international drug trafficking. But the middle part was the Controlled Substances Act. And pretty much what the Controlled Substances Act does is provide regulation of the prescribing process. And it does this by breaking psychoactive drugs down into 5 categories. Schedules 2 through 5 are groupings of useful drugs. Schedule 2 are drugs that have a fairly high potential for abuse, some medical use, and can be used reasonably safely with medical supervision. This includes things like morphine, Oxycontin, amphetamine, methamphetamine. Schedule 3 and 4 are most of the everyday drugs. Not as much risk of abuse, some medical use, somewhat safer. That includes most of prescription psychoactives. Anti-anxiety drugs, muscle relaxants, sleeping pills, antidepressants, some painkillers like, for instance, Vicodin, And stage 5 are those that are safe enough and have such little potential for abuse that they don't need, they can be sold over the counter. Now, if we look at our opiates that we've talked about, morphine and Oxycontin are in Schedule 2. Vicodin and Percocet, which are exactly the same opiate as Oxycontin, are in Schedule 3, but they have a little bit of acetaminophen, Tylenol added into the mixture. Now, ironically, right now they're warning us that the Tylenol will kill you, that acetaminophen will eat your liver up. And we get down to Schedule 4, codeine with Tylenol, and codeine is the second of the great opium drugs. And even when we get down to over-the-counter Schedule 5, we can find some liquid codeine cough syrup mixtures available over the counter, and we find cough syrup with DXM in it, which is one of the teenagers' favorite hallucinogens, and also one that creates a whole bunch of overdose deaths. And the one I haven't mentioned yet is Schedule 1. Schedule 1 drugs are those with high potential for abuse, no appreciable medical use in the United States, and can't be used safely even under medical supervision. Let's take my favorite one. It's got a very high potential for abuse. All you need to do is look at my shape or look at the vending machines in the hallway of any building you go down. It has no known medical use in the United States, although some of its close cousins like glucose do. And if we judge from the amount of morbid obesity and type 2 diabetes in this country, it can't be used safely even under medical supervision. What drug am I talking about? Sugar, cane sugar. Somehow Congress and the DEA have overlooked it. But Schedule 1 includes marijuana, including all parts of the cannabis plant. Hemp, in other words. It includes heroin. It includes LSD, MDMA, psilocybin, mescaline, and a lot of precursor chemicals used to make some of the other designer drugs. Nobody can write you a prescription for these drugs. There's a little bit of research being done under DEA licenses, but no one can manufacture them, no one can sell them, no one can possess them. The hang-up is the DEA keeps telling us that marijuana is not a medicine, but that's not their job. Their job is to tell us whether or not it has an accepted medical use. As we mentioned, 14 states have medical marijuana laws. This week's Newsweek, for February 15th, the back page of it has a listing of the 14 states with medical marijuana and with the number of registered patients in each state. The highest one right now is California, with about 250,000 patients. Rough calculation, I put that at around 0.5% of their population. Now, adding all of the states up, including New Jersey, which they list as 0 since its law was only effective a week or two ago, it came to somewhere around 1/3 of a million people. I mean, I didn't run it through a calculator, I just rounded and eyeballed as I added it up. I would say 1/3 of a million patients is an established medical use. But marijuana has been in front of the DEA for rescheduling 3 times. They have managed to drag the process out so that those 3 times have lasted from about 1974 and one still going on today. And even though their administrative law judge said that his job was to find out whether it's being used, the DEA has always said, we're not going to look at that. We're going to say it's not a medicine. They have tried, although the courts have turned them down, to equate medical use with FDA approval. But as I said, FDA can't approve anything to be a medicine. They can merely say whether or not its label allows it to be marketed in a non-deceptive fashion. We're about out of time.
About 8 minutes.
What?
8 minutes.
Yeah. So what I want to do is move down and look at some of the reform efforts. And why do we need reforms? In 1980, when Ronald Reagan was elected president, the total jail and prison population in the United States was about 400,000 people. A couple of years ago, it had gotten up to 2.5 million. Of those, about 500,000 are more than the total prison population under Reagan were there for drug offenses. Depending upon whose figures you look at, direct cost of trying to enforce the drug laws run somewhere between 14 billion and 50 billion a year. Now you'd think with government accounting we could put a real number on it. But as I said earlier, you can't trust government numbers on things like this. And with marijuana use going from 100,000 to 100 million, has it been effective? Professor Rasmussen in Australia, who's probably the best student on amphetamines, said that if we compare the use of the stimulants, which would be amphetamine, dextroamphetamine, methamphetamine, and Ritalin, in the 60s when it was at the height of its abuse, with the number of people using it today, both legally and illegally, on a per capita basis, it's the same. David Musto, the great historian that started a lot of us off, claimed that in the middle 70s that opiate addiction was at a higher rate than it was in 1914. We've tried a few things, starting with really the Nixon presidency. We've allowed people to go on methadone maintenance to get off of heroin. This is substituting a synthetic opioid for a natural one. We've instituted drug courts, which lets people go through rehab processes instead of going to jail. We've done harm reduction things like needle exchanges for IV drug users, which have cut infection rates for bloodborne diseases like hepatitis C and HIV down drastically. Some of the states have gone through medical marijuana. In Europe, most of Western Europe has now decriminalized marijuana, and states like Portugal decriminalize all personal use drugs, which Mexico has just done. Marijuana and MDMA are usually treated as soft drugs without much government intervention as opposed to hard drugs. Switzerland, the Netherlands, Germany, and now Canada all allow heroin maintenance as well as methadone. And the Czech Republic has out-and-out legalization of marijuana. Now, 30 years ago, roughly, I moved to New Orleans to start teaching law at Loyola University there. When I got there, there was a practically brand new professional football team. And it was a horrible team. The local fans dropped the S and called them the Aints, because they ain't never going to win nothing. The fans wore masks made out of paper bags over their heads so no one would recognize them. And believe me, watching those people, I can tell you, being a Saints fan was miserable. And it didn't look like it ever got any better. But this year, after 40 some odd years, those miserable, lowly ain'ts won the Super Bowl. And if the ain'ts can win the Super Bowl, maybe after only 73 years, we can get rid of the miserable Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. And someday, I'm going to find someone that can tell me why it is that from about 1910 until well in the 1940s, governmental agencies insisted on spelling marijuana with an H instead of a J. And we've got just a couple of minutes. If anyone has a last question or anything they want me to follow up on. Yes?
Would you address to what extent you think racism was actually at the root of the anti-drug laws historically?
Historically, in terms of the first prohibition laws with all of their anti-Irishness, the anti-opium laws on the West Coast with their anti-Chinese. I mean, opium dens lured in sweet, innocent white girls to smoke opium and be violated by those evil Orientals. The anti-cocaine propaganda in the South. Blacks on cocaine can't feel pain and they have super strength. So when they're trying to rape white women, you can't even shoot them. The Southern police had to move from 32 caliber to 38 caliber guns to shoot them down. The anti-Mexican approach of the anti-marijuana laws in the southwestern states, the rather blatant racism of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics and the Marijuana Tax Act. I mean, racism was right on the surface and strong in all of them. I honestly don't think that it had much, if anything, to do with the Controlled Substances Act of 1970 or the later amendments, which really have made a mess out of things. Now, the racial impact of some of these laws, particularly the powder cocaine, crack cocaine disparity, has had a horrible, diverse racial impact. But I think that any kind of really measurable racism in the creation of the laws, well, the last I heard was in testifying for the Boggs Act in '52. Anslinger said the Chinese communists were using heroin to destroy American youth. But I think we're starting to see people pay attention to facts and reasoning. And if that can happen, we'll see drastic changes in the American drug laws. And it can't come too soon for me.
Thank you so much, Professor Terrell.
Okay. And we're